11:58 p.m. inside the Sterling Charity Gala, New York City. Slap, the sound cracked across the ballroom like a gunshot. Harper's head snapped sideways. A red handprint burned across the poor maid's pale cheek as champagne glasses shattered around her feet. "You read nothing but worthless help," Eleanor Sterling hissed, her diamond-covered face twisting with satisfaction. "Now kneel and clean my dress." Harper's eyes filled with tears, but she slowly straightened her spine. "I may be a maid," she whispered, staring back at Eleanor, "but I am still a human being." Furious, Eleanor raised her hand to strike again. Suddenly, every chandelier went black. The ballroom doors slammed open. Dominic Russo stood beneath the blood-red emergency lights, surrounded by armed men. His expression turned deadly when he saw Harper's swollen cheek. "Who?" the mafia boss growled, locking the doors behind him. "Put their hands on my only maid." And when Eleanor finally discovered who Harper truly was to him, it was already too late. Stay with us. Like, comment, and subscribe as this shocking story begins. Harper Vance ran a microfiber cloth along the lip of a Ming Dynasty vase. They told her it was worth 50 grand. She treated it exactly the same way she treated the $10 coffee mugs in the staff kitchen, with care, because that was just who Harper was. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, rain hammered against the bulletproof glass. 3 men in tailored black suits stood on the terrace. They had earpieces. They had bulges under their jackets that definitely weren't cell phones. Harper didn't even blink. She just popped her wireless earbud back in and let the audiobook narrator's voice wash over her. It was a Tuesday, just a regular Tuesday at the Russo estate. She wasn't scared of the guards. They didn't scare her, because they didn't really look at her. To most of the world, a maid in a gray apron was just part of the furniture. Invisible. But Harper didn't mind being invisible. Invisible paid $35 an hour. Invisible paid for Lily's spinal treatments. Her 10-year-old sister was her entire universe. Every time Harper scrubbed a marble floor or polished a billionaire's chandelier, she wasn't doing it out of submission. She was doing it out of love. There is a deep, quiet dignity in honest work. Harper's mother had taught her that before she passed away in a sterile county hospital room. Dignity is not a price tag you wear. Harper, it's the spine that keeps you standing. Don't ever let anyone tell you you're less than them just because your hands are dirty. She lived by those words. She breathed them. They were the armor she wore underneath her cheap cotton uniform. The heavy oak doors of the grand foyer swung open. The air in the room instantly dropped 10 degrees. The audiobook in Harper's ear didn't drown out the sudden, deafening silence that fell over the house. The guards outside stiffened, dropping their hands to their waists. The other staff members in the adjacent hallways vanished like ghosts. Dominic Russo was home. He walked in, shrugging off a soaking wet cashmere overcoat. He looked exhausted. There was a dark, rust-colored smudge near the cuff of his crisp white shirt. Nobody asked what it was. Dominic was a man who moved like a shadow, cold, calculated, terrifying to anyone who owed him money or crossed his boundaries. But as his dark eyes scanned the massive, empty foyer, they landed squarely on Harper. She didn't drop her gaze. She didn't scurry away like the others. She simply finished wiping the antique vase, folded her cloth into a perfect square, and offered a polite, simple nod. "Welcome back, Mr. Russo." Dominic stopped, the towering, feared boss of the city's underbelly paused in his tracks just to look at the 24-year-old girl in the plain apron. "Harper," he said, his voice was a low, gravel rumble that usually made grown Zens sweat. "You're working late again." "Just finishing the West Wing," she said, keeping her tone light. "The dust doesn't sleep just because you're out of town." He walked over to the mahogany side table. He didn't demand a drink. He didn't snap his fingers for service. He poured a glass of water from the heavy crystal pitcher, and then, without a single word, he poured a second glass. He held it out to her. Harper stepped forward and took it. "Thank you." It was a small gesture, a microscopic detail in the grand, violent scheme of his dark world. But it meant everything. Dominic Russo didn't serve people. Yet here he was, handing a glass of water to his maid. 2 years ago, Harper had found his private, highly encrypted ledger left carelessly on a sofa cushion. She could have sold it to the feds for enough money to cure Lily twice over. She could have blackmailed him. Instead, she just put it gently on his desk and went right back to vacuuming the rug. When Dominic had cornered her, demanding to know why she didn't look inside, she had simply looked up at him and said, Because it isn't mine. That was the day Dominic realized respect isn't something you buy. It's something you witness. Get some rest, Dominic told her, taking a slow sip of his water. A person's worth isn't measured by how many hours they break their back for someone else. You've done enough today. Go home to your sister, he saw her. He really saw her, not as property. Not as a machine meant to wipe up his messes, but as a human being who deserved absolute respect. I will, Harper said, offering a genuine smile. Have a good night, Dom. She was the only person in the state who dared call him by his first name. He gave a rare, faint smirk in return. Harper was just reaching back to untie the knot of her apron when the security intercom buzzed. It was a harsh, jarring sound that completely shattered the quiet respect in the room. Leo, the head of security, stepped into the foyer. His face was carved from stone, his hand resting casually near his holstered weapon. Boss, we have a situation at the front gate. Dominic X's expression immediately hardened. The faint warmth vanished, replaced by the icy mafia boss the city feared. I didn't authorize any visitors. Leo, they didn't ask for authorization. Leo replied, his jaw tight. It's Senator Sterling's wife, and she's not taking no for an answer. Outside, a fleet of 3 black SUVs aggressively bypassed the outer checkpoint, their heavy tires screeching on the wet gravel. The doors flung open before the vehicles even fully shifted into park. Out stepped Eleanor Sterling. She was a woman dripping in diamonds, wrapped in a designer fur coat that cost more than Harper would make in a decade. She walked with her chin tilted high, her lips pressed into a thin line of disgust. She carried the absolute, unshakable certainty that the world existed solely to serve her. She didn't just walk, she invaded. The peaceful sanctuary of the Russo estate was gone. The storm hadn't just stayed outside the glass. It had just walked right through the front door, wearing expensive perfume and a mask of utter arrogance. Harper didn't know it yet, but the quiet life she had built to protect her sister was about to be burned to the ground. The heavy oak doors clicked shut. Dominic Rousseau didn't even look at the woman standing in his foyer. He simply turned to Leo, his right-hand man. Handle the perimeter. I need to take a call with Chicago, Dominic said. He walked up the sweeping marble staircase. He left Eleanor Sterling standing right there on the imported rug. It was a calculated insult. In Dominic's world, you didn't demand an audience. You earned it. Eleanor's face flushed red beneath her layers of expensive foundation. She clutched her designer handbag so tight, her knuckles turned white. She wasn't used to waiting. She was the wife of Senator Sterling. When she walked into a room, people bowed here. No one cared. Harper quietly slipped back into the room. She had a job to do. She walked over to the mahogany side table and began arranging a silver tea set. It was basic hospitality. It didn't matter who the guest was. Eleanor glared at the young woman in the gray apron. She looked at Harper the way someone might look at a stain on the floor. You, Eleanor snapped. Her voice was sharp, grating. Bring that over here now. Harper didn't flinch. She placed a delicate porcelain cup onto a saucer. She walked over to the plush velvet sofa where Eleanor had seated herself. Harper lowered the tray onto the glass coffee table. Earl Grey, ma'am, Harper said. Her voice was calm even, completely devoid of fear. Eleanor didn't reach for the cup. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. She smelled like heavy rose perfume and cold arrogance. Do you know who I am? Eleanor asked. I know you are a guest in Mr. Russo's home. Harper replied gently. Is there anything else you need? Eleanor hated that tone. She hated the quiet dignity in Harper's gray eyes. A maid shouldn't look a billionaire in the eye. A maid should look at the floor. You're insolent, Eleanor sneered. People like you forget your place. You think because you work in a mansion, you belong in one. You're nothing. You're the help. Harper stood up straight. Her mother's voice echoed in her head. Dignity is the spine that keeps you standing. My place is doing my job, ma'am, and I've done it. Enjoy your tea. Harper turned to walk away. She didn't see Eleanor's hand shoot out. She only felt the sudden, agonizing burst of heat. Eleanor swiped her manicured hand across the tray. The porcelain cup shattered against the floor. Boiling water splashed directly onto Harper's wrists and forearms. Harper gasped. The pain was instant, blistering, searing into her skin. But she didn't scream. She clamped her teeth shut. She grabbed her own wrist, her breathing ragged, staring at the spreading red marks on her skin. Eleanor sat back, casually smoothing the skirt of her dress. She smiled. A cold, sadistic smile. Look at that. You made a mess. Clean it up. Harper looked at the shattered porcelain. She looked at the woman sitting on the couch. No, Harper said. Her voice shook with pain, but not with submission. You threw it. Eleanor's smile vanished. Her eyes went flat and dangerous. She slowly reached into her designer handbag and pulled out her phone. She didn't break eye contact with Harper. Harper Vance, isn't it? Eleanor said. Harper froze. The air left her lungs. I did a little background check on Dominic's staff before I came here. Eleanor continued, tapping the screen. You have a sister, Lily, 10 years old. Severe spinal scoliosis. She's receiving experimental treatments at the Sterling Memorial Care Center. Harper's heart slammed against her ribs. Leave her out of this. I sit on the board of directors for that charity. Harper, I am the charity. With one phone call, your sister loses her funding. She gets discharged tomorrow morning, into the state system. Do you know what happens to crippled children in the state system? The room started spinning. Harper felt the blood drain from her face. The burns on her arms pulsed with agony. But she couldn't feel them anymore. All she could see was Lily, Lily smiling. Lily in pain, Lily being thrown out onto the street. You wouldn't, Harper whispered. She's a little girl. She has nothing to do with this. I absolutely would, Eleanor said. Her voice was ice, because people like you need to be reminded of reality. You have no rights here, you have no power. You only have what people like me allow you to have. Eleanor pointed a diamond-ringed finger at the floor, at the spilled tea and the shattered cup. Now get on your knees and clean my shoes. Harper couldn't breathe. Every instinct in her body screamed to fight, to slap the woman across the face, to defend her human dignity. But dignity couldn't pay for spinal surgery. Dignity couldn't keep Lily walking. If it was just her, Harper would have walked out the door. But it wasn't just her. Poverty is a gun held to your head, and Eleanor Sterling had her finger on the trigger, slowly, agonizingly. Harper bent her knees. The physical pain in her burned arms was nothing compared to the crushing weight on her soul. She lowered herself to the cold marble floor. She took the edge of her gray cotton apron. She reached out with trembling, blistered hands, and she wiped the drops of tea from Eleanor's leather heels. Eleanor let out a soft, satisfied laugh. That's better. That's exactly where you belong. Harper kept her head bowed. A single silent tear slipped down her cheek and hit the marble floor. Her spirit felt entirely crushed, ground into dust beneath a designer's shoe. Then the heavy footsteps sounded on the stairs. Dominic Russo walked into the room. He stopped dead in his tracks. He looked at the shattered teacup. He looked at Eleanor, sitting high and mighty. And then he looked at Harper. Kneeling on the floor, her hands bright red and trembling. Wiping a shoe, Harper slowly stood up. She kept her eyes on the floor. She couldn't bear to look at him. She had lost. The silence in the room was terrifying. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the silence right before a bomb detonates. The air pressure in the grand lounge seemed to double. Dominic didn't yell. He didn't rush forward. He walked slowly down the remaining stairs. His dark eyes were locked on Harper's blistered forearms. He saw the red, angry skin. He saw the wet tear track on her cheek. Get out. The words were spoken so quietly they almost didn't register. Eleanor blinked. She adjusted her posture, trying to maintain her regal air. Excuse me, Dominic. I came here to discuss the zoning permits in the South District. My husband needs your network too, I said. Get out. Dominic shifted his gaze to Eleanor. The look in his eyes was so profoundly violent, so deeply devoid of human warmth, that Eleanor actually shrank back against the velvet cushions. You are making a mistake. Dominic, Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice steady as she stood up. You don't want an enemy in the Senate. Senator Sterling is a politician. I am a consequence, Dominic replied. His voice was a flat, dead calm. If you are not off my property in exactly 10 seconds, you will not leave it at all. Eleanor swallowed hard. She grabbed her bag. She didn't say another word. She walked briskly past him, the click of her heels echoing rapidly down the hallway until the heavy front doors slammed shut. The estate was quiet again. Harper stood shivering. She pulled her burned arms against her chest. She felt humiliated, stripped bare. She waited for Dominic to tell her to clean up the mess. She was just the maid. Sit down. Harper looked up. Dominic was pointing to the plush armchair across from the sofa. I need to clean this, Harper whispered, staring at the broken porcelain. I said, sit, Harper. It wasn't an order from a boss. It was a plea from a protector. Harper slowly sank into the armchair. Dominic walked out of the room. A moment later, he returned with a white first aid kit. He pulled a small ottoman over and sat directly in front of her. The boss of the city's criminal underworld, sitting on a footstool, in front of his maid, he gently reached out and took her wrists. His hands were large, calloused, but incredibly careful. He didn't flinch at the blistering skin. He opened a tube of burn ointment and began applying it with feather-light strokes. The cool gel hit her skin, stopping the fiery pain. Harper let out a shaky breath. She couldn't stop the tears now. They fell silently, tracking down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Dominic looked up, his brow furrowed. "For what? I didn't fight back. She threatened my sister. She said Lily would lose her medical care. I had to kneel, I had to." Dominic's jaw tightened, a muscle feathered in his cheek. He unrolled a spool of white gauze and began wrapping it carefully around her forearm. "You didn't lose your dignity because you knelt to save your sister, Harper," Dominic said. His voice was low, steady. "You showed exactly how strong you are. The woman who walked out of here. She is weak, she needs money and fear to make herself feel tall. True power isn't forcing people to their knees. True power is having the strength to pull them back up." Harper stared at him. The man holding her hands was supposedly a monster, a criminal, but in this room, right now, he was the only person who had ever treated her like a human being. He taped the end of the bandage. He looked into her gray eyes. "No one is going to touch your sister." Dominic promised. It was an ironclad vow. "And no one will ever touch you again. You are safe here, do you understand me? You are safe." The heavy weight on Harper's chest finally lifted, for the first time in years. She didn't feel alone. She didn't feel like she had to carry the entire world on her shoulders. She was safe. Dominic was going to protect them. She offered a small, broken smile. "Thank you, Dom." He reached up and gently wiped the tear from her cheek with his thumb. It was a perfect, quiet moment of healing, a victory over the cruelty of the world. Then, the night shattered. Blue and red lights strobed violently through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting frantic, spinning shadows across the living room walls. The sound of heavy sirens wailed. Cutting through the rain, tires screeched on the driveway outside. A voice boomed through a megaphone, rattling the glass. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. Dominic Russo, we have a warrant for this premises. Open the gates or we will breach." Harper's heart dropped into her stomach. Dominic stood up slowly. The warmth in his eyes vanished instantly. The green flag was gone. The mafia boss was back. Chaos erupted. The front doors didn't just open. They were kicked in. Dozens of men in tactical gear flooded the grand foyer. Assault rifles swept the room. Flashlights cut through the dim lighting. Water dripped from their boots onto the pristine marble floors. Leo and the estate guards instantly drew their weapons, forming a wall between the door and Dominic. The tension was a lit fuse. One wrong twitch, and the room would turn into a slaughterhouse. "Stand down, Leo," Dominic ordered. His voice sliced through the yelling. Leo hesitated, then slowly lowered his weapon. The FBI agents pushed forward. A man in a sharp suit walked in behind them. Special Agent Harris, a known asset on Senator Sterling's payroll. "We have a federal warrant," Russo Harris sneered, waving a piece of paper. "Money laundering, racketeering, stolen federal bonds. Search the house." Dominic said calmly. He didn't even blink. He knew his estate was clean. He never kept dirty paper in his own home. He was a ghost. "Oh, we will," Harris smiled. A dirty, knowing smile. "Check the staff quarters first." Lockers. Dominic's eyes narrowed. A dozen agents rushed down the west corridor toward the kitchen and staff rooms. Harper stood frozen in the lounge. She clutched her bandaged arms. She had never been around guns. She had never seen anything like this. Minutes ticked by like hours. The house was being torn apart. Cushions ripped, paintings pulled down. Then an agent jogged back into the foyer. He was holding a heavy black leather pouch. "Found it, sir," the agent said, handing it to Harris. Harris unzipped it. He pulled out a stack of bearer bonds and a flash drive. Federal evidence, enough to put someone away for 20 years. "Where did you find it?" Harris asked loudly, making sure everyone in the room heard. "Staff locker room, locker number 4. Harper's breath hitched. Locker 4, that was her locker. Harris looked at the roster in his hand. He looked up, his eyes locking directly onto Harper. "Harper Vance," Harris said. He pulled a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. "You're under arrest for federal conspiracy and theft of government property." Harper backed up, her eyes wide with sheer terror. "No, I didn't do that. That isn't mine. I don't know how that got in there." Dominic stood perfectly still. His mind processed the information in a microsecond. Eleanor Sterling's driver. When Eleanor had barged in, her driver had been left unattended near the SERV's entrance for 5 minutes. It was a plant, a setup, but it was a brilliant one. If Harper was arrested with federal bonds, The state would immediately seize custody of Lily. Lily would be thrown into a ward tomorrow morning. Harper would rot in a federal cell, leveraged by the senator to testify against Dominic. There was only one way to break the legal link. Dominic had to sever his connection to Harper completely. He had to make the FBI believe she was completely worthless to him, a rogue employee acting alone. If he protected her right now, they both went down and Lily was lost forever. He had to become the monster. Two agents stepped forward and grabbed Harper by her arms. She cried out in pain as their heavy hands clamped down right over her fresh burns. "Dom," Harper cried out, looking at him with wide, desperate eyes. "Dom, please. Tell them." Dominic slowly turned to face her. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated ice. There was no warmth left. No humanity. He looked at her exactly the way Eleanor Sterling had looked at her. Like dirt. "Get your hands off my property." Dominic snapped at the agents. The agents paused. Dominic walked right up to Harper. He looked down at her. He made sure his voice was loud enough for every federal agent to hear. "You stole from me," Dominic sneered. His voice dripped with venom. Harper stopped crying. She stared at him. Confused. "What? No, Dom, I didn't." "Shut up." Dominic barked. He grabbed her by the shoulders. He squeezed hard. "You thought you could run a side hustle in my house. You stupid, pathetic little girl. You're a maid. You clean toilets. Did you really think you had the brains to pull off federal theft under my roof?" Every word was a knife, a jagged blade driven straight into her chest. "Dom, what are you doing?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please." "My name is Mr. Russo." Dominic spat. He reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills. With a violent flick of his wrist, he threw the money directly into Harper's face. The bills fluttered to the marble floor, scattering around her cheap canvas shoes. "You're fired," Dominic said loud. Cruel, final. "Take your severance pay and get out of my sight. You disgust me." He turned to Agent Harris. "She's a rogue thief. Do whatever you want with her. She means absolutely nothing to me." Harris frowned. This wasn't the play. They expected Dominic to protect her, to claim the bonds were his to save her, catching him in the trap. Instead, the mafia boss was throwing her to the wolves. "Kick this trash out of my house." Dominic ordered his own guards. Before the FBI could even process the legal pivot, two of Dominic's massive security guards grabbed Harper. They didn't read her rights. They just hauled her backward. "No, please," Harper screamed. The betrayal ripped her soul in half. The man who had just bandaged her hands. The man who told her she was safe. He had thrown her away like garbage. They dragged her to the front doors. They threw her out. Harper hit the wet gravel hard, scraping her knees. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind her. The lock clicked. She was outside. The storm raged. The freezing rain poured down in sheets, soaking through her thin cotton uniform in seconds. The cold bit into her skin. But it was nothing compared to the cold inside her chest. She sat on the wet gravel. She pulled her knees to her chest. She wrapped her freshly bandaged, aching arms around her legs. Everything was gone. Her job, her protection, her sister's medical care, her dignity. She had trusted him. She had actually believed that someone in this dark, cruel world saw her as a human being. But she was wrong. She was just a pawn. A disposable maid. She squeezed her eyes shut. She let the rain wash away her tears. She had hit absolute rock bottom. She was completely, utterly powerless, crushed beneath the boots of billionaires and mobsters. She didn't know how long she sat there in the freezing rain. 5 minutes, 10, then, the low hum of an engine broke through the sound of the storm. Tires crunched on the gravel. Headlights cut through the dark, blinding her. A black, unmarked SUV pulled up right beside where she sat in the mud. The engine idled. The rain pounded against the dark-tinted windows. Slowly, the passenger side window rolled down. Leo sat in the driver's seat. His face was grim. He leaned over. "Get in, Harper," Leo said softly. "The boss sent me." The rain was so heavy it felt like stones hitting the pavement. Harper just stared at the open window of the SUV. She couldn't process it. Her brain was completely short-circuiting. Less than 10 minutes ago, Dominic Russo had thrown money in her face and kicked her out like a stray dog. Now his head of security was telling her to get in. "Harper, we don't have time," Leo said. His voice was tight. "Get inside the car before the feds sweep the perimeter." She didn't move. She just shivered. Her wet hair plastered to her face. "Is this a joke? He fired me. He threw me out." Leo let out a hard breath. He pushed the passenger door open from the inside. "He saved your life," Leo said. "Now get in the damn car." Harper climbed in. The leather seat was warm. The heater was blasting. She pulled the door shut. and the heavy thud instantly cut out the roaring sound of the storm. Leo slammed his foot on the gas. The heavy SUV peeled away from the curb, its tires gripping the wet asphalt as they sped away from the sprawling estate. Harper wrapped her arms around herself. Her bandages were soaked. Her forearms throbbed with a dull, sickening ache. "I don't understand," she whispered. Her teeth were chattering. "He humiliated me in front of everyone." Leo kept his eyes glued to the dark. He was driving fast. Very fast. But his hands on the steering wheel were perfectly steady. He had to, Leo said quietly. If the boss claimed that bag of bonds was his, they would have arrested him. And if they arrested him, they would have held you as an accomplice. The feds were bought and paid for by Senator Sterling. They weren't there for justice. They were there for leverage. Harper stared at the dashboard. "Leverage you," Leo said, glancing at her. "You are the leverage, Harper. Sterling's wife knows you matter to the boss. If they took you in, they would have immediately seized your sister. The state would lock Lily in a ward by morning. Sterling would use Lily to force you to testify against Dominic." The boss saw the play the second that agent held up the bag. Harper felt a cold knot form in her stomach. It wasn't just a raid, it was a hostage situation waiting to happen. "So he cut me loose," Harper said. Her voice was hollow. "He cut the legal tie," Leo corrected. "He made you look like a thieving maid, a liability, someone he didn't care about. He gave them zero reason to arrest you. It was the only way to get you out of that house without handcuffs on your wrists." Leo reached over and tapped the side of her canvas tote bag resting at her feet. "Check the front pocket." Harper frowned. She reached down with trembling fingers. She unzipped the small front pocket of her bag. Her fingers brushed against something hard, cold, metallic. She pulled it out. It was a tiny black GPS tracker. "He slipped it in your bag when he threw the money at you," Leo explained. "He didn't throw you away, Harper. He pushed you out of the crossfire so I could find you." Harper stared at the blinking red light in her palm. The absolute terror of the last 30 minutes started to melt. It was replaced by something else. A heavy, overwhelming realization. Dominic Russo had played the villain so she could survive. He had swallowed his own pride, let a group of corrupt feds raid his home, and orchestrated a brutal piece of theater just to protect a maid and her little sister. Because to Dominic, human life was worth more than his ego. "Where are we going?" Harper asked. Her voice was finally steady. "We're getting Lily," Leo said, taking a sharp left turn. The tires screeched. "The senator owns the charity that funds that care center. It's not safe. The boss set up a safe house in Vancouver. We have a private medical team waiting for Lily at the border. We get her, we get on a train. And we disappear until the boss burns Sterling network to the ground." Harper nodded. She clamped her hands tightly together. They were doing this. They were actually running. 20 minutes later, Leo parked the SUV in the shadowy alley behind the Sterling Memorial Care Center. It was past midnight. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle. "The front desk is clear," Leo said, checking a tablet on his dashboard. He had tapped into the building's security feed. "Lily's room is on the second floor. Room 204. We go in through the service elevator. We have exactly 4 minutes before the night nurse does her rounds." "I know the way," Harper said. They moved fast. They slipped through the loading dock doors. The hospital smelled like bleach and stale coffee. Harper's heart pounded against her ribs. She led Leo down the sterile white hallway, keeping her footsteps light. They reached room 204. Harper pushed the door open. Lily was asleep. The 10-year-old girl looked incredibly small in the large hospital bed. The metal brace holding her spine straight was a cruel reminder of how fragile she was. Harper walked over to the bed. She gently stroked Lily's hair. "Lily, sweetie, wake up." Her large brown eyes fluttered open. She looked at Harper, confused. Then she looked at the giant, intimidating man in a black suit standing by the door. "Harper," Lily mumbled, rubbing her eyes. "Why are you wet? We're going on a trip." "Bug," Harper whispered, forcing a warm smile. "Right now. A really cool train ride. But we have to be super quiet." "Okay." Lily trusted her sister completely. She didn't argue, she just nodded. Leo stepped forward. He didn't treat Lily like a fragile piece of glass. And he didn't treat her like a burden. He treated her with careful respect. He unhooked the monitors with practiced hands. He gently lifted Lily out of the bed, being incredibly mindful of her back brace. "I got you, kid," Leo said softly. They made it out of the hospital in exactly 3.5 minutes, when they got back into the SUV. Harper finally let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for an hour. Lily was safely buckled into the back seat, wrapped in a warm blanket, already drifting back to sleep. They drove through the dark city streets toward the central train station. Harper looked out the window at the blurred city lights. She had been so scared, so completely broken when she sat in the mud outside the estate. But looking at Lily in the rearview mirror, she felt a surge of incredible relief. They were going to make it. Dominic had a plan. Leo was here. They were safe. Leo parked a few blocks away from the station. The rain had stopped entirely, leaving the night air thick and cold. The train leaves in 10 minutes, Leo said, handing Harper an envelope. Passports, cash, tickets, everything is under an alias. Once you cross the border, a man named Silas will meet you on the platform. You trust him, only him. Are you coming with us? Harper asked as she grabbed her bag. Leo shook his head. I get you on the train. Then I go back to the boss. He needs his right hand for what comes next. They walked quickly toward the station. The terminal was vast, almost entirely empty at this hour. The high vaulted ceilings echoed with the sound of their footsteps. A janitor pushed a mop bucket in the distance. A voice over the intercom announced the final boarding call for the northbound express. Harper held the tickets in her hand. She looked down at Lily, who was holding her hand tightly. They were at the platform. The train doors were open. The conductor was standing there, checking a watch. Victory. It tasted like cold air and adrenaline. They had won. Harper smiled at Leo. Thank you for everything. Leo offered a rare, genuine smile. You're a good person, Harper. The boss knows it. Have a safe trip. Harper turned toward the train doors. She took one step. Then the massive overhead lights of the train terminal violently flickered once, twice, and then the entire station went pitch black. The darkness was absolute. It wasn't a power outage. Power outages had emergency generators that kicked in within seconds. This was deliberate. Someone had cut the main line. Get, Leo roared. His voice didn't echo. It was immediately drowned out by a sound Harper would never forget. Prt, prt. It was the sound of suppressed gunfire. High-velocity rounds tearing through the air. The glass schedule board next to Harper's head shattered into a million pieces, raining down on her shoulders. Leo tackled Harper and Lily to the cold concrete floor behind a thick steel pillar. Harper screamed, pulling Lily underneath her body. She covered her sister's ears. Lily was crying, burying her face into Harper's wet shirt. Stay down, do not move, Leo yelled. He drew his weapon in a fluid, practiced motion. He peeked around the edge of the steel pillar. In the dim moonlight filtering through the high skylights, Harper saw them, 4 men moving in perfect tactical formation across the terminal floor. They wore dark tactical gear, no badges, no police markings. These weren't feds. These were private mercenaries. Cleaners. Eleanor Sterling didn't wait for the law. She brought her own. Leo fired 3 rapid shots. The booming sound of his unsuppressed handgun was deafening in the enclosed space. One of the approaching shadows dropped hard to the floor. Move, Leo barked at Harper. Down the tracks go. Harper grabbed Lilia's hand. She scrambled to her feet. Her knees were scraped and bleeding, but she didn't feel it. Pure, unfiltered adrenaline pumped through her veins. She dragged Lily away from the pillar, running down the dark platform parallel to the train cars. She heard more suppressed shots behind her. Pfft. Then she heard a heavy grunt. Harper turned her head. Leo had stepped out from behind the cover of the pillar. He was drawing their fire. He was standing in the open, firing relentlessly to keep the mercenaries pinned down while Harper and Lily ran. He took a bullet to the shoulder. His body jerked backward, but he didn't drop his gun. He kept firing, keep running. Leo screamed at her, his voice tearing at his throat. He took a second bullet. This one hit him in the thigh. Leo went down on one knee, but his hand was still steady. He fired again, taking down a second mercenary. Harper stopped. She couldn't leave him. He was dying for them. Leo, Harper screamed, tears streaming down her face. Leo looked back at her. His face was pale in the moonlight. Blood was pouring from his shoulder, soaking his white shirt. He didn't look scared. He looked furious. Run, you idiot. Save the kid. It was a direct order, a final command. Harper sobbed. She pulled Lily and turned to run toward the maintenance exit at the end of the platform. But they were too slow. 2 more figures dropped down from the pedestrian bridge above them. They landed heavily on the concrete right in front of Harper, cutting off her escape route. Harper skidded to a halt. She pushed Lily behind her back, shielding the little girl with her own body. She looked wildly for a weapon, a piece of glass, a pipe, anything, but her hands were empty. Her wrists were still wrapped in gauze. Throbbing with pain, one of the mercenaries stepped forward. He didn't even raise his gun. He didn't need to. He was a professional, and she was a maid. He swung the heavy stock of his rifle directly into Harper's ribs. The crack was sickening. Harper collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. The pain was blinding. Harper, Lily screamed. The little girl tried to hit the man, swinging her small fists against his armored vest. The man simply grabbed Lily by the back of her coat and lifted her off the ground like a rag doll. "Let her go," Harper choked out, spitting blood onto the concrete. She tried to crawl forward, reaching for her sister. "Don't touch her. Please, gag them. Get them in the van." A cold voice echoed from the darkness. A third man walked out of the shadows. He looked down at Leo, who was lying in a pool of his own blood, unconscious but still breathing. The man kicked Leo's gun away. Heavy hands grabbed Harper by her hair. They dragged her across the rough concrete. She fought. She kicked. She dug her fingernails into their wrists, but it was useless. They were too strong. A piece of thick cloth was shoved into her mouth. Tape was wrapped tightly around her head. Her hands were pulled behind her back and bound with a viciously tight zip tie. They threw her into the back of a panel van. She hit the metal floor hard. A second later, Lily was thrown in beside her. The little girl was sobbing uncontrollably, her hands bound with a smaller zip tie. The heavy door slammed shut, plunging them into total darkness. The engine roared to life. The van sped away from the station. Harper laid on the cold metal floor. She pressed her face against Lily's shoulder, trying to offer comfort. She couldn't speak. Her shield had fallen. Leo was gone. Dominic's plan was in ruins. Harper realized with a terrifying, crushed certainty that no one was coming to save them now. She was completely at the mercy of a woman who had none. The van ride felt like an eternity in hell. When the doors finally swung open, blinding light flooded the dark interior. Rough hands grabbed Harper by her bound arms and yanked her out. She stumbled, falling onto a paved driveway. They dragged Lily out right behind her. Harper blinked against the harsh lights. She looked around. They weren't at a police station. They weren't at a warehouse. They were at a sprawling, hyper-modern mansion. Valets were parking luxury sports cars. Soft jazz music drifted through the air. Women in designer gowns and men in tailored tuxedos were walking up the grand front steps. It was the Sterling Charity Gala. The mercenaries didn't take them through the front door. They dragged Harper and Lily down a side path, through a discreet service entrance, and into a bright, sterile commercial kitchen. Caterers in white coats scrambled out of the way, keeping their heads down. Nobody asked questions. You didn't ask questions when armed men walked through Senator Sterling's house. They pushed Harper into a small, windowless pantry room and threw her into a metal chair. They cut the zip ties on her wrists and ripped the tape off her mouth. Harper gasped, coughing violently. Lily Harper croaked, reaching out. Keep your hands to yourself." The voice cut through the room like a razor blade. Eleanor Sterling stepped out from behind a row of metal shelving. She was wearing a breathtaking emerald green evening gown. Diamonds glittered at her throat. She looked like royalty. She looked at Harper like a pest she had finally trapped in a jar. "Mrs. Sterling," Harper begged, "please let my sister go. She's sick." "She needs her medicine," Eleanor smiled. It was a terrifying, hollow smile. She snapped her fingers. One of the mercenaries grabbed Lily and pulled her toward the door. "No, Lily," Harper lunged forward. A mercenary drove a fist directly into Harper's stomach. Harper collapsed back into the chair, gagging, fighting to pull air into her bruised lungs. "Take the child to the holding room upstairs," Eleanor instructed without even looking at Lily. "Make sure the state's social workers have the paperwork ready. If I say the word, she goes straight to the juvenile ward." Harper, Lily cried as she was dragged out of the room. The heavy door clicked shut behind her. Harper doubled over, tears streaming down her face. She was completely broken. Her spirit, her fight, everything she had built to survive, it was gone. "Look at you," Eleanor sneered, stepping closer. "You actually thought you could run. You thought a common thug like Dominic Russo could protect you from me. Let this be a lesson, Harper. In the real world, money is God. And people like you are meant to worship." Eleanor picked up a folded piece of fabric from a nearby prep table. She tossed it directly into Harper's face. It was a uniform, a cheap, stiff, black and white maid's uniform. "Put it on," Eleanor commanded. Harper stared at the fabric. "What? I have 200 of the most powerful people in the state drinking champagne in my ballroom right now," Eleanor said smoothly. I want them to see what happens to arrogant little girls who forget their place. You are going to serve my guests tonight. Harper, you are going to carry a tray, pour drinks, and keep your head bowed. Harper looked at the uniform. It wasn't just a job, it was a public execution of her dignity. Eleanor wanted to parade her around like a conquered animal. I won't do it, Harper whispered. Eleanor's smile vanished. She pulled her phone from her clutch. She tapped the screen and held it up. It was a live video feed of a dark room upstairs. Lily was sitting in a chair, crying. Two stern-looking women in cheap suits were standing over her holding clipboards. State workers, you see them. Eleanor asked softly. They are waiting for my call. If you disobey me, if you drop a glass, if you speak out of turn, if you do anything other than act like the obedient, worthless servant you are, I make the call. Your sister disappears into the system tonight. You will never see her again. Harper stared at the screen. The small flicker of defiance in her chest was completely extinguished. The billionaire wasn't just taking her freedom. She was demanding her soul. Poverty and desperation do not negotiate, they dictate. Harper slowly reached up. With shaking, blistered hands, she unbuttoned her wet, ruined shirt. She slipped into the cheap black dress. She tied the white apron around her waist. It felt like a straitjacket. Good girl, Eleanor mocked. Now go grab a tray of champagne. And remember, I am watching your every move. Harper walked out of the pantry. The commercial kitchen was a blur of noise and heat. A caterer shoved a heavy silver tray loaded with crystal champagne flutes into her hands. Harper pushed through the swinging double doors and stepped into the grand ballroom. It was spectacular. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings. A string quartet played softly in the corner. The room was packed with men in tuxedos and women in jewels. It was the most beautiful room Harper had ever seen, and it felt exactly like a prison cell. She walked among them. She offered champagne to politicians who were laughing about tax cuts. She served drinks to socialites who didn't even look at her face. She was invisible again, but this time, it wasn't a choice, it was a punishment. Her ribs ached with every step. Her burned wrists screamed under the weight of the silver tray. Her heart was a lead weight in her chest. She looked across the room. Eleanor was standing with a group of wealthy investors. Eleanor caught Harper's eye. The older woman slowly raised her champagne glass in a mocking toast. Harper looked away. She stared at the marble floor. Don't let them tell you you're less than them. Her mother's voice echoed weakly in her mind. But it was hard to believe those words right now. It was hard to believe in human dignity when it could be bought and sold by a woman in an emerald dress. Harper gripped the edge of the silver tray. She was crushed. She was helpless. But deep down in a place Eleanor Sterling couldn't reach, a tiny ember of anger remained. Harper took a breath. She straightened her spine just a fraction of an inch. She was a hostage in an apron. But the night wasn't over yet. Some slaps leave a mark on the skin. Others start a war. Harper walked through the sea of silk and tuxedos. The silver tray in her hands felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Her burned wrists screamed with every step, but she kept moving. She had Lily's life depended on it. The ballroom was loud. Rich people laughing, glasses clinking. A string quartet playing something light and cheerful. It was a perfectly orchestrated illusion of class. Eleanor Sterling stood near the center of the room. She was surrounded by investors and politicians. She held a crystal flute of champagne, smiling at something a congressman just said. But her eyes were tracking Harper. Harper tried to steer clear. She walked behind the group, intending to pass toward the catering doors. Eleanor shifted her weight. She took half a step backward, and she deliberately stuck out her foot. Harper's cheap canvas shoe caught the edge of Eleanor's heel. Harper stumbled hard. She fought to keep her balance. The heavy silver tray tipped. 3 crystal glasses slid off the edge and shattered on the marble floor. A splash of cold champagne hit the hem of Eleanor's emerald gown. The music didn't stop, but the conversation around them died instantly. Eleanor let out a sharp, theatrical gasp. She looked down at her dress. Then up at Harper. You clumsy, stupid girl, Eleanor shouted. Her voice was designed to carry. It sliced through the ballroom. People turned their heads. The room began to quiet down. The string quartet slowly stopped playing. Harper dropped to her knees. Her instincts flared. She tried to pick up the broken glass. Leave it, Eleanor snapped. Harper froze. She slowly stood back up. Her heart hammered against her bruised ribs. She looked around. 200 pairs of eyes were staring at her, judging her, pitying her. I am so sorry, Mrs. Sterling, Harper said quietly. Eleanor scoffed. She stepped closer. Do you have any idea how much this dress costs? It costs more than your miserable life. The senator stepped up behind his wife. He looked at Harper with mild disgust, like a pest that had wandered indoors. Eleanor, darling, just have security throw her out. No, Eleanor said, raising a hand. Her eyes never left Harper. She needs to learn. People like her are forgetting the natural order of things. Eleanor turned slightly, addressing her wealthy guests. She was putting on a show, a public execution. This is the problem with society today, Eleanor announced. We treat the help like they are human beings. We let them think they have rights. They don't. You don't have rights, Harper. You are property. You are a maid. You are born to serve your betters, and you will die exactly as you are, worthless. Harper felt a tear slip down her cheek, not from sadness, from pure white-hot rage. I am a human being, Harper whispered. Her voice shook, but she forced the words out. I work hard, I take care of my family. I am not worthless. Eleanor's face contorted with fury. A maid had talked back. A maid had defied her in front of her peers. Eleanor raised her hand. The slap echoed like a gunshot. It was brutal, vicious. It snapped Harper's head to the side. The sting radiated across her cheek, hot and sharp. A few guests gasped. Some looked away. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody said a word. Harper stood perfectly still. Her cheek burned. Her ear was ringing slowly. She turned her head back. She didn't touch her face. She didn't cower. She straightened her spine, ignoring the agonizing pain in her ribs. She looked dead into Eleanor Sterling's eyes. She remembered her mother. Dignity is the spine that keeps you standing. Eleanor saw the defiance that infuriated her. She raised her hand to strike again, but the blow never landed. The massive crystal chandeliers above them suddenly clicked off. The ballroom plunged into darkness. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Panic spiked a second later. The emergency lights flickered on. The room was bathed in a deep, blood-red glow. The gentle hum of the party was gone. The speakers crackled. A slow, chilling classical symphony began playing over the sound system. It was heavy, ominous, like a funeral march. The heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom unlatched with a loud clack. They slowly swung open. Dominic Russo stood in the doorway. He wore a pitch-black suit. He didn't look like a businessman. He looked like the devil himself. Behind him stood a dozen men in tactical gear. Real tactical gear. The air in the room vanished. Dominic stepped inside. He didn't say a word. He signaled with 2 fingers. His men stepped in and pulled the heavy oak doors shut. They slid a thick steel bar across the handles. The doors were locked. No one was leaving. Dominic Russo walked through the crowd. Billionaires, politicians, and socialites parted like the Red Sea. They scrambled to get out of his way. They pressed themselves against the walls. The sheer, suffocating gravity of his presence choked the room. He didn't look at the senator. He didn't look at the armed guards standing in the corners. He only looked at the red mark on his maid's cheek. Dominic stopped right in front of Harper. Harper was trembling. Not from fear of him, from relief. He came for her. Dominic slowly raised his hand. He didn't care who was watching. He gently touched her unbruised cheek, his thumb brushing away a stray tear. His dark eyes softened for a fraction of a second. A silent promise, I've got you. Then he turned to face Eleanor Sterling. The softness vanished. He became a weapon. Russo Senator, Sterling barked, stepping in front of his wife. He tried to puff out his chest. He tried to look brave. What is the meaning of this? You are trespassing. My security will shoot you where you stand. Dominic didn't even blink. Your security works for me now. The private mercenaries standing around the perimeter of the room slowly lowered their rifles. They placed them on the floor. Dominic had bought them out 3 hours ago. Senator Sterling turned pale. You think you won, Dominic asked quietly. His voice was a low rumble that carried over the classical music. You raided my home. You shot my best friend. You put your hands on my family. Family, Eleanor spat, finding a sliver of false courage. She's a maid. She's nobody. Dominic took a step toward Eleanor. She shrank back. She is worth 1,000 of you, Dominic said. The ballroom doors at the side entrance burst open. A new group of men flooded in. They wore blue windbreakers with bright yellow letters on the back. FBI, but these weren't the corrupt agents from earlier. The lead agent walked straight up to Senator Sterling. He flashed a badge, Senator Robert Sterling. You are under arrest for treason, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit murder. Sterling's jaw dropped. You can't do this. I own your boss anymore, Dominic said. Your offshore accounts are empty. Your wiretaps are sitting on the desk of the Attorney General. And the judge you bought just flipped on you 10 minutes ago. You have nothing. The FBI agents grabbed the senator. They slammed handcuffs onto his wrists. He began screaming, demanding his lawyers. As they dragged him out of his own ballroom, Eleanor stood frozen, the color completely drained from her face. Her empire was collapsing in real time. Dominic turned his back to her and faced the terrified crowd of elites. Listen to me closely, Dominic projected. His voice commanded absolute silence. You measure wealth by designer tags and bank accounts. You think money buys you the right to treat people like dirt. He pointed to Harper. This woman scrubbed your floors. She worked 16 hours a day to save her sister. She never stole. She never lied. She held on to her honor while you sold yours to the highest bidder. Dominic's eyes swept the room. Human dignity isn't a privilege reserved for the rich. It is a fundamental human right. Respect is earned through character, not bought with a credit card. Anyone in this city who forgets that will deal with me. The silence was deafening. The educational value of the moment wasn't a lecture. It was a brutal reality check. It was the absolute destruction of their toxic class system. Dominic turned back to Eleanor. She was shaking now. Her husband was gone. Her money was gone. She was entirely alone. Dominic, Eleanor pleaded. Her voice was thin, pathetic. Please. I didn't know. You knew exactly what you were doing, Dominic said coldly. You wanted to teach her a lesson about the natural order of things. Now, I'm going to teach you. Dominic looked down at the puddle of spilled champagne and broken glass on the floor. He looked back at Eleanor. Clean it up, Eleanor stared at him in horror. What? I said. Clean it up, Eleanor looked around. She looked at her wealthy friends. None of them made eye contact. They looked away, they abandoned her. Dominic stood over her, unmoving, unslowly, tears of absolute humiliation streaming down her face. Eleanor Sterling bent her knees. She lowered herself to the marble floor in her $20,000 couture gown. She reached out with shaking hands. She used the hem of her expensive dress to wipe up the spilled champagne. Harper watched. She didn't feel joy. She didn't feel triumph. She just felt a profound sense of justice. Karma didn't just balance the scales. It shattered them. Dominic didn't watch Eleanor finish. He turned to Harper. He gently wrapped his arm around her shoulders. Let's go, get said softly. 6 months later, the scars had faded, but the strength remained. Harper stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of her new office. The view looked out over the city skyline. But she wasn't looking at the skyscrapers. She was looking at the courtyard below. Lily was walking. She didn't have the heavy metal brace on anymore. She was holding a nurse's hand, taking slow, careful steps through the garden. She was laughing. Harper smiled. A real deep smile that reached all the way to her eyes. The courtyard belonged to the Russo Pediatric Center. It was a brand new, state-of-the-art facility funded entirely by Dominic's legitimate enterprises. It provided free, world-class medical care to families who couldn't afford it. And Harper was the director of the board. She wasn't wearing a cheap cotton apron anymore. She wore a sharp, tailored navy suit. She looked powerful. But more importantly, she looked at peace. The door to her office clicked open. Leo walked in. He moved a little slower these days. He had a slight limp from the bullet in his thigh, and he leaned on a sleek black cane. But he was alive. He was smiling. Director Vance, Leo teased, taking a seat on the leather sofa. The accountants just sent over the quarterly projections. You managed to double the outreach fund. Don't call me director, Leo. Harper laughed, walking over and sitting across from him. And yes, it turns out when you don't embezzle money like the Sterlings, you can actually help people. Leo chuckled. Fair point. Kid looks good out there. She's doing amazing, thanks to you. Leo waved it off. He didn't like being called a hero. He just did his job. Speaking of jobs, the boss is on his way up, Leo said, tapping his cane on the floor and standing. I'll leave you two to it. Leo slipped out the door just as Dominic walked in. Dominic Russo still wore dark suits. He still commanded a room the second he stepped into it. But when he looked at Harper, the icy exterior completely melted away. Busy day? Dominic asked, walking over to the small kitchenette in the corner of her office. Always, Harper said softly, watching him. Dominic didn't sit behind a desk and bark orders. He picked up the electric kettle. He placed a tea bag into a ceramic mug. He poured the hot water. He walked over and placed the cup of tea gently on the table in front of her. It was a perfect, quiet reversal of their past. He wasn't serving her out of submission. He was serving her out of respect. Out of love. They were absolute equals. Dominic sat down next to her on the sofa. He didn't sit across the room. He sat close. I saw Lily in the garden, Dominic said, his voice low and warm. She told me to tell you she wants pizza for dinner. She knows I always say yes to pizza. Harper smiled, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. She looked at him, really looked at him. They had survived a nightmare together. They had burned down a corrupt empire and built something beautiful from the ashes. Trauma doesn't define a person's worth. Surviving it does. Dominic reached out. He gently took her hand, his fingers traced the very faint, faded scar on her wrist from the burns. You did this, Dominic said, looking around the office, looking at the hospital. You built this. Harper, we built it, she corrected him. No, Dominic said softly, locking eyes with her. I just provided the bricks. You provided the soul. You taught me that true power isn't about crushing people beneath you. It's about pulling them up to stand beside you. He leaned in. It wasn't rushed, it was deliberate and gentle. He kissed her. It was a promise. A seal on the new life they were building together. Harper kissed him back, letting go of the last heavy weights she had carried for so long. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a protector. The story of the arrogant woman and the poor maid was over. Katz Eleanor Sterling was currently serving a 10-year sentence in a federal minimum security prison. Her husband was locked away for life. They had learned the hard way that a person's worth isn't found in a bank account. True worth is found in the courage to remain kind in a cruel world. True worth is the dignity you refuse to let anyone take away. Harper Vance took a sip of her tea. She looked out the window at her sister, walking freely in the sun. She had never felt more powerful. Dui de la duan outro ting ang zai quang 5 foot, viet lien makt teng mo duan van, dup chung vào phum za con người. Lam thi sing, ting yêu bao vệ và ý nghĩa thật sự của quyền lực trong câu chuyện Harper Dominic. And so Harper Vance's journey did not truly end when Eleanor Sterling was led away in disgrace, nor when the powerful guests in that ballroom were finally forced to confront the cruelty they had quietly accepted. It ended 6 months later, beneath the warm sunlight of a pediatric care center, where Lily was learning to walk, and families who once had nowhere to turn were receiving the treatment they deserved. Harper had entered Dominic Russo's world wearing a simple gray apron, invisible to nearly everyone around her. She had no fortune, no political influence, and no armed men waiting for her command. Yet by the end of the story, she possessed something far more powerful than any of those things. A dignity that cruelty could wound but never permanently destroy. Harper reminds us that honest work never makes a person inferior. The uniform someone wears, the neighborhood they come from, the money in their bank account, or the job they perform cannot determine the value of their life. She cleaned floors and polished furniture, but she was never beneath the people who owned them. Her hands were marked by labor because she was fighting to protect the sister she loved. Every hour she worked was an act of sacrifice, responsibility, and devotion. Eleanor saw a maid and assumed she saw weakness. Dominic looked at the same woman and recognized integrity. That difference reveals one of the most important lessons of this story. People show us who they truly are by how they treat those who cannot offer them status, wealth, or advantage. Anyone can behave respectfully towards someone more powerful. Character is revealed in the way we treat the worker carrying a tray, the employee cleaning a room, the patient who cannot pay, or the stranger who appears to have nothing. Eleanor possessed money, connections, and social influence, but she had no true strength. She needed threats, humiliation, and a sick child's medical care to force another human being onto her knees. Harper, by contrast, knelt to protect Lily. That moment did not make her weak, and it did not take away her dignity. Sometimes, people endure humiliation not because they lack courage, but because they are carrying responsibilities greater than their own pride. A mother may remain silent to protect her children. A sister may accept pain to save someone she loves. A struggling worker may tolerate injustice because another life depends on the next paycheck. We should never mistake survival for surrender. Harper's love for Lily was not a weakness that Eleanor could exploit forever. It was the source of the strength that kept Harper standing when everything else had been taken from her. Dominic's journey carries another powerful message. He began as a feared mafia boss who understood violence, strategy, and control. But Harper taught him that protection means more than destroying an enemy. True protection means seeing another person's humanity, respecting their choices, and creating a world in which they no longer have to live in fear. When Dominic pretended to reject Harper during the raid, his words broke her heart. But his purpose was to sever the legal chain that would have placed both Harper and Lily in the hands of corrupt authorities. He accepted being seen as a monster because, in that moment, her safety mattered more than her admiration. Yet the story also shows that sacrifice without truth can cause deep wounds. Protection should not become possession, and love should never demand blind obedience. What ultimately made their relationship meaningful was not Dominic's power over Harper, but his willingness to place that power in service of her freedom. He did not keep her in an apron and call her protected. He helped create a future where she could stand beside him as an equal, lead an institution, and use her own voice to protect thousands of vulnerable families. That is the difference between controlling someone and truly loving them. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.